People don't stop listening because of what someone says. They stop listening because their brain has already decided that person isn't worth listening to. And that decision happens in the first few seconds, often without a single word being spoken. It happens because of signals being sent that probably aren't even conscious. Signals about status, about certainty, about the right to take up space in the room. Signals that communicate either trust me or don't, listen to me or ignore me. And most people make that final choice before the speaker has even finished the first sentence. You're sitting across from someone who matters, and you finally decided to say what you've been holding back for months. The words come out carefully, honestly, and for a moment, there's silence. Then they look at their phone, or they nod absently, or they respond with something that shows they didn't hear a single thing you just said. The reason has nothing to do with the clarity of your words or the importance of what you shared. In that moment, despite everything you tried to communicate, you became invisible. Maybe this happens at work. Someone is in a meeting with people they've known for years, and they share an observation about a problem nobody else has noticed. 3 seconds pass. Then another person makes basically the same point. And suddenly everyone's leaning forward, taking notes, asking follow-up questions. The difference wasn't in the idea itself. The difference was in whether anyone was actually listening to them, or if they'd already been filed away as background noise in everyone's minds. Or maybe it happens at home. Someone tries to talk to their partner about something that's been weighing on them, something real and vulnerable. And they can feel the exact moment when their partner's attention leaves. They're still physically in the room, but mentally they've already moved on to thinking about dinner or work or whatever comes next. And the speaker is just talking to an empty space. The loneliness of that moment is sometimes worse than actual silence, because at least silence is honest about what's happening. This has nothing to do with intelligence or competence, or how well someone actually speaks. There are brilliant executives, experienced therapists, thoughtful parents, and genuinely wise people who experience this exact thing again and again. They say something true and important, and the world just passes right through it as if they never spoke at all. The problem isn't on their end. Here's what most people tell themselves when this happens. Maybe I'm not explaining it well enough. Maybe I need to be more confident. Maybe I should speak louder or slower or with more conviction. So they try to fix themselves, thinking the problem is something inside them, something broken or insufficient or not quite right. But that's not where the actual problem lives. The problem isn't the words. It's not the confidence level. It's something far more subtle, and once it's understood, everything changes. The signals that decide whether someone will be heard are almost invisible. They're not about eloquence or intelligence or how carefully someone has prepared their message. They're about the invisible status hierarchy that exists in every room. They're about whether someone's own nervous system is sending out signals of certainty or doubt, of someone who believes they have the right to speak, or someone who's apologizing for taking up space. They're about the emotional state of the person listening, whether they're defensive or open, whether they feel safe or threatened by what's being said. These forces work beneath the surface, shaping every conversation, and most people never even notice them happening. This book exists because anyone who's felt this way deserves to be heard. Not in some motivational, everything is possible kind of way, but in the actual, practical, daily reality of life. Anyone over 40 has earned the right to be listened to through decades of living, through all the times they've kept quiet when they shouldn't have, through all the moments they've been invisible when they were trying to speak. A voice matters, and not because someone is special or talented or famous. It matters because it's yours, and the people in that person's life, family, colleagues, partner, and themselves, need to hear what they actually have to say. In the chapters ahead, the myths about communication that have been holding people back will be dismantled. Real examples from films everyone knows will appear, from news stories that actually happened, from situations that probably feel uncomfortably familiar. The discovery will come. Why people aren't listening, and more importantly, what can actually be done about it. These aren't tricks or manipulation tactics. This is about understanding how human attention works, and then using that understanding to speak in a way that finally gets through. The chapters will explore the invisible hierarchy that decides who gets heard in any room. They'll examine the emotional defenses that make people shut their ears the moment they feel threatened, even if someone is trying to help them. They'll look at why logic fails and stories win. They'll investigate the gaps between what someone thinks they're communicating and what people actually hear. They'll address the ways a person's own doubts about themselves sabotage their words before they even leave their mouth. And they'll work with the reality that sometimes the best thing someone can do is learn to listen before asking to be heard. But here's what this book is not. It's not a course in how to manipulate people into doing what someone wants. It's not about becoming louder or more aggressive or more certain. It's not about toxic confidence or hustle culture or any of that noise. It's about becoming more genuinely yourself, more truthful, more grounded in what actually matters, so that when someone speaks, people can feel that they mean it. Over the next hours of listening, someone will encounter people who learn this the hard way. Some of them are famous, people whose stories have probably been heard before, but never in this particular light. Others are ordinary people who did something extraordinary by simply deciding to speak differently and to listen more deeply. Their journeys show what's possible when the invisible forces that control whether people hear someone are finally understood. The work starts now, not tomorrow, not when feeling more confident, not when circumstances are perfect. Today, because every conversation between now and when finishing this book is an opportunity to practice, to notice, to understand oneself in a completely different way. And the shifts can start immediately. Some of them will be small, the way eye contact is held, the pace of breathing when speaking, a single sentence rephrased. But small shifts compound. They build on each other, and within weeks, someone will notice that people are responding differently. Silence has served a purpose for many. It's kept them safe, maybe. It's prevented confrontation, protected from judgment, allowed them to avoid the risk of being really seen. But that person isn't here to be safe anymore. They're here because some part of them knows that they have something to say, and they're done with being invisible. So let's begin. Because the best part of someone's life, the part where they're finally heard, where their words have weight, where the people they love actually understand what they're trying to tell them, that part is waiting. And it starts with understanding exactly why people have stopped listening and what it actually takes to get them to start again. Are you ready? Chapter 1. The Filtering System. The most famous scene about communication failure in cinema happens in Cool Hand Luke from 1967. A prison warden looks directly at the main character and delivers the line that became legendary. What we've got here is a failure to communicate. But the irony of the scene is devastating. The warden isn't trying to communicate at all. He's not asking questions or attempting to understand. He's simply announcing the problem from a position of absolute authority, as if the failure has nothing to do with him and everything to do with the prisoner's inability to comply. The warden is the perfect example. of someone who's already decided. This person is not worth listening to, and nothing they say will change my mind. This is how most people actually operate, even though they don't realize it. The human brain doesn't work like a blank slate waiting to receive information from everyone equally. It works like a filter system with a very specific job. Determine what's worth paying attention to and what should be ignored as background noise. That filter is powerful, and it gets built in seconds. Sometimes it gets built before anyone even speaks. The filter isn't conscious. It's not something someone chooses deliberately. It's a survival mechanism, and it's been running in the background since early childhood, learning patterns about who matters and who doesn't. Someone walks into a room, and within moments, everyone has already made a decision about whether to listen to them or not. A woman raises her hand in a meeting, and colleagues have already started tuning her out before she opens her mouth, their brains filing her away based on past patterns. Not just about her, but about women in meetings, or people at her level, or people who speak in a certain tone. A man tries to talk to his adult children about something important, and they're already thinking about what they'll say in response. Not what he's actually saying, because decades of family history have taught them that his words are usually the prelude to advice or criticism. The filter has closed, and the person might as well be talking to a wall. This filter isn't logical or fair, and it's not based on how smart someone is or how important their message actually is. There's a real historical example that shows this perfectly. In the late 1990s, a financial analyst named Harry Markopolos spent years bringing evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the organization literally responsible for catching fraud, trying to explain that Bernard Madoff's investment returns were mathematically impossible. He had the numbers. He had the analysis. He had the proof laid out clearly, even submitted formal complaints with detailed calculations. But Madoff was famous, successful, wealthy, and had the status of a Wall Street legend. Markopolos was just a guy with a spreadsheet and a concern. So the regulators didn't listen. They filed his warnings away, barely glancing at them. The Madoff scandal became one of the largest financial frauds in history, costing people billions of dollars, ruining retirements, destroying families. The information was right there. The person trying to share it was competent and correct. But the filter had already decided. Madoff is important. This analyst is not. And that decision cost the world dearly. The brain's filtering system works on several invisible tracks at once. And understanding these tracks is crucial to understanding why someone might not be heard. One track is constantly evaluating status. Who in this situation has authority, resources, confidence, the right to speak? The brain is asking, does this person have the power to affect my life? Are they higher or lower than me in the hierarchy? Should I pay attention because they might reward me? Or should I dismiss them because they can't? Another track is checking for threat. Does this person's message make me feel unsafe, exposed, stupid, or wrong about something I believe? When the brain detects threat, it stops listening and starts defending. A third track is assessing relevance. Is this information connected to my survival, my safety, my values, my identity, or something I actually care about right now? If the message doesn't hit on one of those tracks, the brain simply routes it to the trash and moves on without hesitation. When someone speaks and doesn't get listened to, they usually assume the problem is in their delivery. They think they weren't clear enough, confident enough, prepared enough, or maybe they didn't have the right credentials or title. But the actual problem almost never lies there. The actual problem is that the filter closed before they started talking. And the filter closed based on signals that have almost nothing to do with the quality of what they're about to say. The filter closed because of how they stood in the room, the tone of their voice, whether they hesitated or apologized for taking up space, whether the other person felt safe listening to them, whether the message seemed relevant to the listener's immediate concerns. A person over 40 knows this feeling in their bones. They've spent 2 decades watching ideas they had dismissed until someone else, someone younger, someone with the right title, someone with better status signals, someone who spoke with absolute certainty, said basically the same thing and got applause. They've brought legitimate concerns to leadership only to have them ignored until a crisis proved they were right. And then everyone acts surprised that nobody saw it coming. They've tried to have vulnerable conversations with people they love and felt the moment the door closed, the moment they stopped being heard and started being tolerated. They've watched their children dismiss their advice and then make the exact same mistakes, as if the parents' experience counted for nothing. The experience teaches a painful lesson. It's not about being right or having good ideas. It's about whether the other person's filter has decided you're worth listening to. Here's where most people get stuck. They believe the solution is to try harder, be more confident, speak louder, get more credentials, work harder to prove yourself. But that's like trying to open a locked door by pushing harder on the handle. The lock is already engaged. The filter is already closed. And the harder someone pushes, the more defensive the other person often becomes, because now they feel pressured, which activates the threat response, which closes the filter even tighter. It's a feedback loop that makes things worse, not better. But the good news is that filters can be understood. They're not random, and they're not invulnerable. They operate on predictable patterns, and once someone learns those patterns, they can shift them without becoming fake or manipulative. A person can learn to speak in a way that keeps the filter open. They can understand the invisible hierarchy that exists in every room and navigate it consciously instead of bumping into it in the dark. They can recognize when someone's emotional defenses have kicked in and communicate in a way that keeps those defenses from slamming shut. They can learn to speak with their whole body, not just their words, so that the signals being sent are congruent and believable. These aren't tricks. They're not manipulation. They're just how human attention actually works. And understanding it means someone can finally be heard. The reason someone isn't being heard isn't because there's something wrong with them. It's not because they're not smart enough or experienced enough or confident enough. It's because they're bumping against a system they don't yet understand. And here's the thing about systems. Once you understand them, you can navigate them. Once you see the invisible rules that are running in the background, they stop being invisible. They stop being fate. They become something that can actually be changed. Your challenge for this chapter: notice one moment today where someone didn't listen to you, or where you felt yourself tuning someone else out. Write down what happened right before the listening stopped. Was it something they said? The way they said it? Something about the situation? The goal isn't to judge yourself or them. It's just to start noticing the pattern, because noticing is where change begins. Chapter 2. The Invisible Hierarchy. Why they listen to them, not you. In the 1999 film Office Space, there's a scene that captures something most people have experienced but can't quite name. The main character, Peter, is sitting in a corporate meeting surrounded by managers who are obsessed with procedure, rules, and metrics. Peter tries to explain something genuine about why he hates his job, about the meaninglessness of what he's doing, about the gap between what he's supposed to care about and what he actually cares about. He's being honest. He's being clear. But as he speaks, He watches the managers respond with corporate jargon, with references to TPS reports and cover sheets, with talk of motivation problems and synergy. They're not hearing him. They're not even trying to understand him, because in their minds, the hierarchy has already been established. He's a mid-level programmer, they're managers, and that difference in status means his reality doesn't get to interrupt their reality. This is the invisible hierarchy, and it's running in every room, in every conversation, in every interaction that happens between human beings. It's not necessarily about official titles, though titles can reinforce it. It's something deeper, a sense of who belongs at the table and who's just grateful to have a seat, who has the right to speak and whose job is to listen, who's making the decisions and who's just providing input. Someone walks into a room and that hierarchy is already being constructed. A woman in her 50s with extensive experience proposes a solution to a business problem. A younger man with a more impressive title suggests something similar 5 minutes later. The younger man gets the attention. Not because his idea is better, not because he's smarter, but because the room's status hierarchy has already positioned him as someone worth listening to, and her as someone providing supportive information. It's not fair. It's not rational, but it's consistent and it's predictable, which means it can be understood and navigated. The hierarchy is built on visible and invisible signals. The visible ones are easier to spot: job title, age, appearance, how expensive someone's clothes are, whether they speak with an accent that marks them as an outsider. But the invisible signals are actually more powerful. These include the way someone takes up physical space, whether they sit back in their chair or perch on the edge, whether their shoulders are relaxed or tensed, whether they take up half the table or try to make themselves small. They include the way someone manages silence. A high-status person can sit quietly and everyone waits for them to speak. A low-status person fills silence with words, with explanations, with apologies. They include tone of voice. Someone with high status speaks with a certain groundedness, a pace that assumes people will wait for them to finish. Someone with low status often rushes, speeds up, as if they need to get their words out before someone interrupts them. There's a real-world example of this happening in a context where the stakes were extremely high. During the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, a young Chinese doctor named Li Wenliang tried to warn his colleagues and superiors about a new and dangerous virus spreading in his city. He had seen the patients. He understood the symptoms. He was trying to raise an alarm about something that would eventually kill millions of people. But he was young. He wasn't the official spokesperson. He didn't have the authority status that would have made people listen. So when he tried to communicate the danger, he was silenced. He was accused of spreading rumors and causing panic. The authorities told him to stop talking about it. And by the time people finally listened, it was too late. The virus had already spread across the world. One of the few people who saw the danger clearly couldn't be heard because he didn't have the right status signals. The tragedy of this example is that it wasn't about Li Wenliang's competence or the clarity of his message. It was about the fact that the hierarchy had already decided. This young doctor doesn't have the authority to make alarming claims. So the system filtered out his warnings, and the world paid an enormous price for that filtering. What makes the invisible hierarchy particularly insidious is that most people don't realize they're participating in it. They think they're being logical, making decisions based on merit and evidence. But studies have shown again and again that people literally don't hear the same information the same way, depending on who's delivering it. The exact same argument about company strategy sounds convincing when the CEO says it, and sounds confused when it comes from someone 3 levels down. The exact same observation about a relationship problem sounds wise when it comes from someone people respect and sounds like complaining when it comes from someone without status. The difference isn't in the quality of the thinking. The difference is in the status of the person speaking. The good news is that status in these invisible hierarchies isn't fixed. It's not something someone is born with and stuck with forever. It's something that's constantly being renegotiated in every interaction. And the signals that communicate status aren't mysterious or impossible to understand. They're actually quite simple once someone knows what to look for. High-status signals include speaking at a measured pace, not rushing to fill silence, finishing sentences completely without apologizing or hedging, making direct eye contact, keeping shoulders relaxed and open, sitting back in chairs rather than perching on edges, saying what someone thinks without excessive qualification or disclaimers, being willing to say no or I disagree, taking up physical and conversational space without apology. A person doesn't need to be naturally confident to send these signals. They can be learned. They can be practiced. They can be integrated into how someone shows up in the world. Low-status signals, the ones that make people tune out before you've even finished your first point, include speaking too quickly, filling silences with words or filler sounds like and like, apologizing before stating opinions, over-explaining or adding too many qualifications, avoiding eye contact, making yourself physically small, speaking quietly, asking permission to speak. Can I say something? Is it okay if I share something? Softening everything with disclaimers. I might be wrong, but this probably doesn't matter, but these signals communicate to the listener's brain that this person doesn't quite believe in themselves. And if they don't believe in themselves, why should I listen? Here's what's crucial to understand. Changing status in the hierarchy isn't about becoming arrogant or dismissive or aggressive. It's not about fake confidence or pretending to be someone you're not. It's about learning to speak and show up in a way that demonstrates you believe what you're saying is worth listening to, because your brain picks up on that belief or lack of belief before it even processes your words. Someone over 40 has usually spent decades in situations where they've learned to make themselves small. Maybe they were taught as a child that speaking up was rude, that their opinions weren't as important as the opinions of adults, that the safe choice was to be quiet and agreeable. Maybe they had a parent or a partner who dominated conversations, and they learned that it was easier not to fight for space. Maybe they've experienced enough moments of being interrupted or dismissed that they've internalized the belief that people aren't very interested in hearing from them. And those learned patterns are deep. They're automatic. They're not something that can be changed just by deciding to be more confident. But they can be changed by understanding what signals they're sending and consciously choosing different ones. One small shift, speaking slightly more slowly, or finishing a sentence without adding "I think" at the end, or making eye contact with someone while saying something you believe. That small shift changes how the other person receives what you're saying. It changes whether their filter stays open or closes. And once the filter is open, once someone has decided that you might be worth listening to, then your actual words have a chance of getting through. Your challenge for this chapter: spend one day noticing the status signals in conversations around you. Watch how high-status people speak. Notice how their pace is different, how they handle silence, how they don't apologize for taking up space. Then notice one moment where you can shift one small signal in your own communication. Maybe you slow down your speech. Maybe you make direct eye contact with someone while saying something you believe. Maybe you sit back instead of leaning forward anxiously. Pick one small change and practice it. You're not trying to become someone else. You're just learning to communicate in a way that gives your words a better chance of being heard. Chapter 3. The emotional barrier. When people shut their ears to protect themselves, there's a moment in almost every difficult conversation where something invisible happens. Someone is trying to have an honest discussion about something that matters. Maybe it's about money, or infidelity, or a broken promise, or the fact that they're exhausted and need help. They're being vulnerable. They're being clear. And then they watch the other person's face change as the jaw tightens and the eyes go distant. The whole body language shifting from openness into something much more closed off and protective. This is the emotional barrier, and it's one of the most powerful forces that determines whether someone will listen or not. It's more powerful than logic. It's more powerful than being right. It's more powerful than having evidence or credentials or a well-prepared argument. When someone's emotional defenses kick in, their brain literally stops processing the content of what's being said. Instead, it shifts into threat detection mode, treating the conversation like a potential attack that needs to be neutralized. The person hears criticism instead of concern. They hear attack instead of help. They hear judgment instead of love. And no matter how carefully someone has chosen their words, no matter how logical and reasonable their point is, it won't get through. There's a historical example that shows what happens when emotional defenses shut down communication at a crucial moment. When the COVID-19 pandemic first emerged, there were medical professionals in China who understood the danger clearly. But some of them communicated this danger in ways that triggered the defensive responses of the people in power. Instead of presenting the information as, "We have a serious problem and we need to address it carefully," the message sometimes came across as, "You didn't see this coming, and you're failing in your responsibility." Instead of, "Here's what we're learning," it sometimes sounded like, "You were wrong and you should have known better." The emotional content of how the message was delivered made the listeners feel attacked, judged, or exposed as incompetent. And when people feel that way, they don't listen. They defend. They deny. They find reasons to dismiss the person bringing the bad news, even when that news turns out to be critically important. This same pattern happens in families constantly, in workplaces, in relationships of every kind. A parent tries to express concern about an adult-child's relationship, and the child immediately hears judgment about their choices instead of care. A partner tries to bring up a financial concern, and the other partner hears criticism about their spending rather than a legitimate worry. A friend offers advice about a difficult situation, and the person receives it as, "You're messing up your life," instead of support. The content of the message might be accurate, but the emotional signal attached to it closes the door before the actual information has a chance to land where it could actually help. What makes this particularly tricky is that people almost never recognize when this is happening in the moment. They don't think, "My emotional defenses are activated, so I'm going to stop listening now." Instead, they think they're being logical. They think, "This person is wrong," or "This person doesn't understand the situation," or "This person is being unfair to me." They generate reasons to dismiss what's being said. They find flaws in the argument. They point out exceptions or special circumstances. All of this feels like rational thinking, but it's actually the sound of emotional defenses at work, disguising themselves as reason. The emotional defenses get triggered by several predictable things, and understanding these triggers is essential to navigating them. One is shame. When someone says something that makes another person feel stupid, foolish, or exposed in a way that threatens their self-image. A woman mentions that her husband has been drinking more lately, and he hears it as, "You're becoming an alcoholic and you're a bad person." His brain shifts into defense mode immediately. Another trigger is loss of control. When something someone says makes the listener feel like they're being criticized or judged or told what to do, as if their autonomy is being taken away. A manager offers feedback to an employee, and instead of hearing helpful information, the employee hears, "You're not good enough, and I'm disappointed in you." The defenses activate. But maybe the most powerful trigger is threat to identity. When something someone says challenges the way a person sees themselves, or their values, or their choices, the emotional defenses come roaring up with particular intensity. A parent tells an adult child, "I'm worried you're making a mistake." And the child hears, "You're not capable of making good decisions," or "You're not intelligent," or even, "You're not a good person." These threats to identity are powerful because they attack something deeper than behavior or choices. They attack how someone understands themselves at a fundamental level. Here's what happens in the brain when emotional defenses get triggered at this level. The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for threat detection and survival responses, activates. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic, reason, and complex thinking, goes quiet. The person is now operating from a survival brain, not a thinking brain. And the survival brain's job isn't to listen or understand or engage with nuance. Its job is to protect, to defend, to find reasons to dismiss the threat and keep it from causing harm. So even if someone is being absolutely logical and reasonable, even if they're right about everything they're saying, it won't matter. The other person's brain has already decided, "I need to protect myself from this, and I need to do it now." This is why so many reasonable arguments fail completely. This is why someone can explain something perfectly, with clear evidence and careful reasoning, and still not get through to the other person. This is why two people can have completely different memories of the same conversation. It's because one person was in thinking mode and the other was in defense mode. They were literally processing different information. One person was hearing content. The other was hearing threat. The tragedy of this dynamic is that most people double down when they sense the other person isn't listening. They speak louder. They explain more carefully. They provide more evidence and more examples. They get frustrated or angry, which only triggers the other person's defenses more strongly. It becomes a dance where both people are working harder and getting less connection, where every additional word makes the other person feel more attacked, more defensive, more certain that they need to protect themselves. But here's what's important to understand. People's emotional defenses aren't a character flaw or a sign of weakness. They're a feature of how the human nervous system works. They're there because at some point in someone's life, they needed protection. Maybe they grew up in an environment where being vulnerable meant being attacked or criticized. Maybe they had a relationship where expressing their needs meant being controlled or dismissed. Maybe they've experienced enough rejection or judgment that they've learned to protect themselves preemptively, to put up walls before someone else can hurt them. The defenses make sense. They make perfect sense given what that person has lived through. And that means the solution isn't to try to power through the defenses, or to argue someone out of them, or to prove them wrong. The solution is to communicate in a way that doesn't trigger them in the first place. This means changing how something is said before it ever reaches the content level. It means recognizing when the other person's nervous system is getting activated and adjusting course before the defenses fully lock in place and become immovable. This requires a very specific skill: the ability to acknowledge someone's emotional state before presenting your content. Not in a patronizing way. Not in a way that makes them feel like you're diagnosing them or treating them like a child. But in a way that shows you understand what they might be experiencing right now. When a parent wants to talk to an adult child about a concern, the conversation might begin with, "I know this isn't something you want to hear, and I'm not trying to tell you what to do," instead of launching straight into the concern. When a partner wants to bring up a difficult topic, they might start with, "I've been thinking about something, and I want to share it because I care about us, not because I'm upset with you," instead of jumping to the problem. These aren't tricks or manipulation. They're ways of saying to the other person's nervous system, "I'm not a threat. I'm not here to judge you or expose your failures. I'm here because I care about you." The second piece of this is to make the message shorter and clearer than feels natural. When someone is in a defensive state, long explanations feel like attacks. Multiple points feel overwhelming. Additional context feels like the other person is trying to build a case against them, trying to prove them wrong. So the most effective communication in these moments is actually much simpler and more direct than most people think. It's one clear statement, stated with genuine care, and then silence, letting the other person process it without feeling like there's more coming, more arguments to defend against, more ways to be exposed as wrong. Someone over 40 usually has decades of experience of getting this wrong. They've had conversations where they tried to explain something carefully and watched the other person get defensive anyway. They've brought up concerns gently and been met with anger or withdrawal. They've tried to help and been accused of criticizing. They've offered support and been told they're being judgmental. And those experiences teach a bitter lesson. Why bother trying? Maybe people just don't listen. Maybe there's no point in attempting to communicate across these barriers. But the actual lesson is different. The actual lesson is that the way they were communicating, despite their best intentions, was triggering the other person's defenses. And once those defenses are activated, once the nervous system decides it's under threat, nothing gets through. No logic, no evidence, no amount of careful explanation. Learning to communicate in a way that doesn't activate defenses is one of the most powerful skills someone can develop. Because it's not about being right or having better arguments or being smarter than the other person. It's about understanding that the other person's nervous system has to feel safe enough to listen. And when the nervous system feels safe, when the defenses don't get triggered, when the person doesn't feel attacked or judged or threatened, then real communication becomes possible. Then actual understanding can happen. Then change becomes possible. Your challenge for this chapter: think of a conversation where you tried to communicate something important, and the other person got defensive or shut down. Write down what you said, as close to the exact words as you can remember. Then ask yourself, what could the other person have heard in those words that made them feel attacked, judged, or exposed? Not what you intended them to hear, but what they might have actually received. That awareness is the first step toward changing how you communicate in these moments. Chapter 4. You speak logic, they hear story. Why reason loses to narrative. In the 2016 Disney film Zootopia, there's a scene where Officer Judy Hopps, a small rabbit police officer, is trying to convince her jaded partner Nick Wilde that they can solve a case together. Judy has facts. She has evidence. She has a logical argument about why they should work as a team. But Nick doesn't hear any of that. What Nick hears is the same story he's heard his whole life: that small animals like him can't be trusted, that they're naturally predisposed to crime, that the system is rigged against them. Judy's logic bounces off that narrative like rain off a windshield. It doesn't matter how reasonable her argument is. It doesn't matter how right she is. The story that Nick carries in his mind about himself and about the world is more powerful than any evidence Judy can present. This is one of the most important discoveries in understanding why people don't listen. Reason and logic are weak, while stories and narratives are extraordinarily powerful. A person can present the most carefully constructed logical argument, backed by data and research and expert opinion, and it will lose every single time to someone who can tell a better story. This isn't because people are irrational or stupid. It's because the human brain is wired fundamentally to understand the world through narrative. Stories are how we make sense of the chaos around us, how we know whether to trust someone enough to follow them or believe them, and how we construct our identity and decide who we are and what's possible for us. There's a real-world example of this that shows up constantly in business and marketing. Two companies want to communicate their value to consumers. The first company presents logical arguments. Our product has these features. It performs better on these metrics. It's more cost-effective than the competition. The second company tells a story about someone who was struggling with a specific problem, how the product changed their life, and what's possible now that wasn't possible before. The second company wins, almost always, not because their product is objectively better, but because they've tapped into how people actually make decisions. People don't buy products based on specifications or performance data. They buy products based on the story they tell themselves about who they are and what they want to become. This same principle works in every area of human communication. A person can try to convince their partner to change a behavior by listing logical reasons why that behavior is harmful. The partner will feel criticized and defensive immediately. But if instead they tell a story about how the behavior has affected them, about a specific moment when they felt hurt or scared or disconnected, about what they want to experience together instead, suddenly the partner can hear it. The story creates connection. The logic created resistance. The reason for this goes back to how the human brain evolved over millennia. For most of human history, survival depended on being able to understand other people's stories deeply and accurately. If a tribe member came back from hunting and told a story about a dangerous predator in a certain direction, other tribe members needed to understand that story well enough to remember it, to believe it, to act on it, and protect their families. The brain developed to absorb stories and embed them as knowledge, as wisdom, as guidance about how to navigate the world. Logic is a much newer development evolutionarily. It's powerful, but it's also fragile. Logic requires conscious attention and effort. Logic is something someone has to actively work to follow. Stories, on the other hand, bypass all of that cognitive friction. Stories go straight into the emotional and intuitive parts of the brain, where they get stored as truth. This is why people remember stories but forget statistics. A person hears that 1 in 5 people experience depression, and it might not land or mean much to them. But if they hear a story about someone they know who struggled with depression, who felt that specific kind of hopelessness, who tried different things before finding help, that story sticks with them forever. That story changes how they understand the world. That story creates the possibility for them to recognize depression in themselves or others and do something meaningful about it. When someone is trying to be heard, when they're trying to convince someone of something important, the question they need to ask themselves isn't, what are the logical arguments I need to make? The real question is, what story can I tell that would help this person understand what I'm trying to communicate? This doesn't mean making things up or being dishonest. It means understanding that the content is less important than the narrative frame. It means knowing that people will hear you through the lens of the stories they already believe about themselves, about you, and about the world. Here's where this gets tricky. Most people have well-established stories about their lives and about other people. A person might have a story that says, I'm not good at math, or I'm not creative, or people in my family don't become successful, or I'm not someone who people listen to. These stories are incredibly powerful. They shape behavior. They shape what people attempt and what they give up on. They shape who people become. And these stories are remarkably resistant to logic. A person can present all the evidence that someone is actually good at math, that they are creative, that success runs in their family. But if that person's fundamental story says otherwise, the evidence won't land. The story will filter it out. The story will explain it away with ease. The same dynamic happens in relationships and in communication patterns. If someone has a story that says, "My partner doesn't really listen to me," or "My boss doesn't respect my ideas," or "My family thinks I'm the irresponsible one," then everything that happens gets filtered through that story. A neutral comment gets interpreted as criticism. A moment of silence gets interpreted as judgment. A disagreement gets interpreted as dismissal. The person is constantly scanning for evidence that confirms the story they already believe, and they're constantly ignoring or reinterpreting evidence that contradicts it. This is called confirmation bias, and it's one of the most powerful forces shaping human perception. This is the power and the danger of narrative working together. The power is that stories can help someone understand something deeply and remember it forever. The power is that stories can shift how someone sees themselves and what they believe is possible. The danger is that stories can also trap someone, can make them resistant to information that contradicts what they already believe, can make them interpret everything in a way that confirms their existing understanding of reality. A person can spend decades living out a story that isn't even true, simply because they keep interpreting everything as evidence that the story is real. So when someone is trying to be heard, when they're trying to shift how another person understands something important, they have two basic options. The first option is to try to logic someone out of their story, which almost never works and often backfires. The second option is to tell a story that's more compelling, more emotionally resonant, more aligned with how people actually experience their lives. The second option is what actually works. A parent who wants to help their adult child see that they're capable of something they think is impossible isn't going to succeed by listing logical reasons why the child is capable. That might actually trigger defensiveness, because it contradicts the child's core story about themselves. But if the parent tells a story about a time the child did something difficult, about how they approached it, about the specific moment when they realized they could do it, that story can shift things. That story can make it possible for the child to rewrite their own narrative about what they're capable of. A person who wants their partner to understand how much they're struggling isn't going to succeed by explaining logically why their struggle is valid or deserves attention. What will work is telling a specific story about what that struggle feels like, what the mornings are like, what the moment is like when they realize they have to get up and do it all again, what they're afraid of, what they need. That story, that specificity, that vulnerability. That's what creates genuine connection and real understanding between people. Someone over 40 has usually learned the hard way that logic doesn't work. They've spent years trying to reason with people, trying to explain things carefully, trying to present evidence that should convince anyone reasonable, and they've watched it fail repeatedly. What they often don't realize is that they haven't been failing because they're not smart enough or not articulate enough. They've been failing because they've been using the wrong tool. They've been bringing logic to a fight that actually requires narrative. They've been trying to convince through argument, when what would actually work is connection through story. The shift from logic to narrative is significant. because it requires something different from the person communicating. Logic requires being right. Narrative requires being real. Logic requires winning the argument. Narrative requires creating empathy. Logic creates distance and defensiveness. Narrative creates connection and understanding. And connection is what actually allows someone to be heard, what makes a person willing to listen, what opens the door to real change. Your challenge for this chapter: take one important idea you've been trying to communicate to someone, something they haven't seemed to understand or accept. Now rewrite it as a specific story. Not a metaphor or an analogy, but an actual moment from real life that illustrates what you're trying to communicate. Include sensory details. Include the emotion. Include the moment when something shifted or when you realized something important. Then tell that story to the person you want to hear you. Notice what happens when you communicate this way. Chapter 5. When your boundaries are blurry, your words are too. There's something that happens in communication that most people don't even notice until it's too late. The outcome of a conversation is often decided before it even begins, not by the quality of what someone plans to say, but by whether they genuinely believe they have the right to say it. When a person's internal boundaries are unclear, when they're not certain they deserve to take up space or express their needs, that uncertainty comes through in everything. The tone of voice, the pace of speech, the way they frame what they want to say. A woman tries to ask her adult children for help with something important, but she doesn't ask directly. Instead, she hints, softens, apologizes before she even makes the request. I've been thinking, maybe if you weren't too busy, and only if you really want to, you could possibly consider helping me with something small, nothing important. The children don't hear a real request. They hear uncertainty. They hear someone who doesn't quite believe they're worth the effort. And so they don't help, not because they're cruel or dismissive, but because the signal they received was clear. This isn't actually that important to me, so it probably doesn't have to be important to you either. A man wants to set a boundary with his partner about something that's been bothering him for months. But he softens it immediately, hedges it, wraps it in so many qualifications that the actual boundary disappears. I don't want to make a big deal out of this, and you're probably doing the best you can. But maybe sometime when you have a minute, we could possibly talk about how I feel when you do this thing. The partner hears the softening more than the boundary. They hear that the boundary isn't real, that it can be negotiated away, that it's not something he's willing to actually stand on. And so the boundary gets crossed repeatedly, because it was never presented as a real boundary at all. Here's what's actually happening beneath the surface. When someone's internal sense of their own worth is shaky, when they're not certain they have the right to their own needs and boundaries, that uncertainty shows up immediately in how they communicate. The other person's brain picks up on it instantly. The brain is extraordinarily sensitive to these signals. It's reading whether the person talking actually believes what they're saying, whether they believe they deserve to be heard, whether they believe their needs matter, whether they believe they have the right to say no. Based on the answers to those questions, the listener decides whether to take them seriously or dismiss them. This is why so many people over 40 find themselves trapped in patterns where their words don't carry weight or authority. They spent their youth being told, often implicitly, sometimes explicitly, that their needs weren't as important as other people's needs. Maybe they grew up in families where children were expected to be seen and not heard, where a child's job was to adapt to the adults in the room. Maybe they had a parent who dominated conversations and made it abundantly clear that their voice was the important one. Maybe they had a partner early in their adult life who made them feel like their opinions didn't really matter. Whatever the source, they internalized a message deep in their nervous system. My boundaries aren't as solid as other people's. My needs are less important. I should be grateful for whatever I get. And now, decades later, they're trying to communicate as an adult, but they're still operating from that old programming. They're trying to express something important, but they're simultaneously trying not to be too much trouble, not to upset anyone, not to seem selfish or demanding. It's like trying to drive a car with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake simultaneously. The car doesn't go anywhere. The person sounds tentative and uncertain. Their words don't land with the weight they deserve. The solution isn't to become aggressive or dismissive or rude to other people. The solution is to develop a clear internal sense that you have the right to your own boundaries and needs. This isn't about being selfish or self-centered. It's about being an adult. It's about understanding that your needs are as real and as valid as anyone else's. When that internal clarity is there, it changes everything about how someone communicates. The words come out with more authority. The pace slows down. The qualifications and apologies disappear. The person sounds like someone who actually believes what they're saying. There's a profound difference between two versions of the same boundary. The first version: I really hate it when you interrupt me during meetings, and I've been thinking maybe if you have time you could try not to do that. The second version: when you interrupt me in meetings, I lose my train of thought and I feel disrespected. I need you to let me finish speaking. The content is similar. The impact is completely different. The second version communicates that this is a real boundary, that it matters, that it's not negotiable or up for discussion. The first version communicates that it's a preference, maybe, if it's not too much trouble for the other person. When someone's boundaries are clear internally, that clarity shows up everywhere. In their body language, in their voice, in their presence. They sit differently, with their spine more upright. Their voice doesn't trail up at the end like a question. They make direct eye contact. They breathe more deeply and with more steadiness. All of these things communicate to the other person: I'm serious about this. This matters to me. I believe I have the right to say this, and I'm not asking for your permission. The practice is simple, but not easy. It requires noticing the moments when someone softens what they're saying unnecessarily, when they add qualifications that undermine their own point, when they apologize for their own legitimate needs. And then it requires consciously choosing different words, not fake words or aggressive words designed to hurt, just clearer words, words that communicate. I have a right to this. My needs are real. I'm not asking for permission anymore. Your challenge for this chapter: identify one boundary or need that you've been expressing tentatively. Write down exactly what you've been saying, word for word. Then rewrite it as if you actually believed you deserved to have that boundary or need met. No softening, no qualifications, no apologies for existing. Just a clear statement. Practice saying it out loud a few times until it feels real. Feel the difference in your body when you say it with clarity instead of apology. Chapter 6. The sabotage from the past. Your own doubts speak louder than your words. There's a pattern that shows up repeatedly in people's lives, especially for those over 40. Someone goes to speak, and before the words even leave their mouth, there's an internal voice that says something like, "They're not going to listen to me anyway," or "I'm probably wrong about this," or "They're going to think I'm overreacting." This internal voice isn't a conscious thought. It's more like a background program running constantly, filtering everything through a lens of doubt. And that doubt broadcasts itself in ways the person doesn't even realize. The body language shifts slightly. The shoulders tense up just a little bit. The eyes look away at the crucial moment. The voice gets quieter without any conscious decision to make it quieter. The person speaks faster, as if rushing to get the words out before they're interrupted. All of these micro-signals communicate something to the listener before the content of the words even registers. This person doesn't really believe what they're saying. This person doesn't really believe they have the right to be heard. Here's the cruel part. That internal doubt creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Someone doesn't believe they'll be heard, so they communicate in a way that makes it less likely they'll be heard, and then when they're not heard, it confirms the original belief. They think, see, I was right. Nobody listens to me. And they never consider that the outcome was partly created by their own doubt about whether they deserve to be heard in the first place. This pattern often has roots that go deep into childhood and early adulthood. Maybe someone grew up with a parent who never really listened, who was always too busy or too focused on their own concerns. The child learned, my words don't matter. Maybe someone had a sibling who was the favorite, the golden child, and the message was clear. Your accomplishments aren't as impressive. Your ideas aren't as interesting. Maybe someone had a teacher or coach who was dismissive, who made it clear that some people's voices mattered and some people's didn't. Whatever happened, the pattern got installed. People don't listen to me, and that's just how it is. And now, decades later, even when the circumstances have completely changed, even when the person is actually competent and has valuable things to say, that old program keeps running. It's like someone is constantly playing a recording in their head that says, they won't listen, or you're not important enough, or you're probably wrong. And that recording affects everything. What they choose to speak up about, how they frame what they say, whether they even try. The tragedy is that most people don't realize this is happening. They attribute their lack of influence to external circumstances. They think, people in my family just don't listen, or my boss doesn't respect my ideas, or I work in a culture where people like me don't get heard. And while external circumstances do matter, what they're missing is that their own internal narrative is actively creating the very outcome they're experiencing. Breaking this pattern requires something more than just trying harder or being more confident. It requires examining the actual story someone is telling themselves about themselves. What exactly is the internal voice saying? Is it saying, people don't listen to me because I'm not smart enough? Is it saying, I'm too emotional and people dismiss emotional people? Is it saying, I don't have the right credentials so my opinion doesn't matter? Whatever the story is, it's worth looking at directly. Because once someone sees the story they're living, they have the possibility of changing it. Not by pretending the old story isn't there, not by forcing positive thinking, but by recognizing that the story was created based on evidence from a different time in their life, and that evidence might not be relevant anymore. A person who was told as a child that their ideas were silly might have internalized the belief that their ideas aren't valuable. But that was a child, and that was a person with limited perspective saying it. The adult version of that person might have vastly more useful ideas. The practice here is subtle, but powerful. It's about noticing the moment when the internal doubt shows up, when that old story starts playing, and then consciously choosing a different thought. Not a fake positive thought, just a more truthful one. If the internal voice says, they're not going to listen to me anyway, the response isn't, no, they're definitely going to listen and I'm amazing. The response is something like, "I don't actually know whether they'll listen. I might as well try. And even if they don't listen, that says something about them, not about the value of what I have to say." This shift changes the micro signals. When someone actually believes there's a possibility they might be heard, their body language changes. The shoulders relax slightly. The voice gets steadier. The pace slows down. The eye contact becomes more direct. All of these changes communicate confidence, not arrogance, but genuine belief in what they're saying. Someone over 40 has usually lived long enough to have evidence that contradicts the old story. They've probably had moments where they were listened to, where their ideas mattered, where their voice made a difference. But the old story is so ingrained that these moments of evidence get filed away as exceptions rather than as data that might change the overall narrative. The person thinks, well, that one time it worked out, but that was unusual, instead of, maybe I've been wrong about this. The work is about collecting that evidence consciously. It's about noticing when someone does listen, when their words do have impact, when they're wrong about the story they've been telling themselves. And over time, with enough evidence, the old story can start to shift. Your challenge for this chapter: write down the internal story you tell yourself about whether people listen to you. What's the core belief? What evidence are you using to support that belief? Then ask yourself, is there evidence that contradicts this story? Can you think of moments when you were heard, when your words mattered, when you were wrong about this? Write those down too. You're not trying to force yourself to believe something you don't believe. You're just gathering the actual evidence. Chapter 7. People listen to those who listen first. There's a paradox that shows up in communication that most people never notice until someone points it out. The people who get listened to most aren't necessarily the ones who talk the most or the loudest or the most persuasively. The people who get listened to are often the ones who listen first. They understand something fundamental about how human connection works. Attention is reciprocal. When someone feels genuinely heard and understood, their nervous system settles. Their defenses lower. And suddenly, they become able to actually listen to what the other person is saying. In the television series The Crown, there's a scene that captures this dynamic perfectly. Queen Elizabeth sits with one of her sons who is struggling, confused, angry at her for choices she's made. He comes in ready for conflict. But instead of defending herself or explaining her reasoning, she does something unexpected. She listens. She asks him questions about what he's experiencing. She lets him speak without interrupting. She acknowledges what she's hearing. And in that moment, his entire stance shifts. His defensiveness melts. He becomes willing to actually hear her perspective because he's just experienced what it feels like to be genuinely heard by her. This goes against the instinct most people have when they want to be heard. Their instinct is usually to talk more, to explain better, to present their case more convincingly. But that approach often backfires. The more someone pushes to be heard, the more defensive the other person becomes. The more someone talks, the more the other person stops listening. It's a pattern that plays out constantly in relationships, in families, in workplaces, and it's a pattern that almost always ends with both people feeling unheard. But when someone shifts the dynamic, when they pause their own need to be heard and instead focus on genuinely understanding what the other person is experiencing, something fundamental shifts. The other person feels seen. They feel like their internal world actually matters to someone. And in that moment of feeling truly heard, their entire relationship to the conversation changes. Suddenly, they become willing to listen. Suddenly, they become capable of understanding what the other person is trying to communicate. There's a reason this works at a neurological level. When someone's amygdala, the threat detection system in the brain, is activated, they can't actually hear much of anything beyond the signal of threat. The survival brain has taken control. But when someone feels genuinely heard and understood, the nervous system gets a signal that says, "You're safe. This person sees you. You don't need to be on high alert." And when the nervous system feels safe, the amygdala quiets down and the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, comes back online. Now the person can actually listen. So the paradox is this: the way to be heard is often to listen first. Not to manipulate the other person by pretending to listen while actually waiting for your turn to speak, but to actually, genuinely listen. To ask questions about what the other person is experiencing. To communicate back what you're hearing so the other person knows you actually got it. This skill is particularly valuable for people over 40 because it's often something they never learned. Many of them grew up in families where listening wasn't modeled, where parents were too busy or too self-focused to really hear their children. They grew up in work cultures where the loudest person won and the quiet person got overlooked. They grew up in relationships where people talked past each other rather than to each other, where conversations were competitions instead of connections. So listening, real, genuine, focused listening, can feel unfamiliar or even risky. What if I listen to someone and they take advantage of that? What if I stop talking and they just keep talking and I never get my turn? But here's what happens in practice. When someone genuinely listens, when they ask real questions and actually care about the answers, most people respond by becoming more open and more willing to listen back. It's not guaranteed, but it's consistent enough that it's worth trying. People are hungry to be listened to. They've spent so long not feeling heard that when someone finally genuinely listens to them, they become more willing to give that gift back. There's a real-world example of this in the context of deep social division. During times when communities are polarized and people feel like nobody on the other side is listening, researchers have found that when someone takes the time to genuinely understand another person's perspective, not to agree with it, but to actually understand where it comes from and what needs or fears are underneath it, something shifts. The other person becomes less defensive. They become more willing to hear the other perspective. Listening first breaks the cycle of mutual defensiveness. The practice is specific and concrete. It starts with asking a question that shows genuine curiosity, not a rhetorical question or a question with a built-in answer, but a real question about what the other person is experiencing or thinking or feeling. Then it means actually listening to the answer instead of planning your response while they're talking. It means letting there be silence while they think. It means asking follow-up questions that go deeper into what they're experiencing. It means saying back what you heard so the other person knows you actually understood, so they know their perspective landed somewhere. This kind of listening communicates something powerful to the other person's nervous system. You matter. Your internal world is interesting to me. I'm not just waiting for my turn to talk. I actually want to understand you. And in that moment, the entire dynamic of the relationship shifts. The other person becomes willing to listen because they feel like their listening would actually mean something to you. Your challenge for this chapter: choose one person you want to be heard by. Someone who hasn't seemed to listen to you in the past, or someone with whom you've been stuck in a pattern of talking past each other. In your next conversation with them, commit to asking them real questions about their experience and actually listening to the answers. Don't plan your response while they're talking. Don't wait for your turn. Just listen. Notice what happens when someone feels genuinely heard by you, and notice how that shifts their willingness to listen back. Chapter 8. Your body speaks before your words do. There's a scene in the 1999 film Office Space that shows something crucial about nonverbal communication. Peter is in a meeting with his managers, and he's trying to explain something about his work. But his body language tells a completely different story than his words. He's slouched in his chair. His eyes are looking down. His shoulders are hunched forward. His whole physical presence communicates, "I don't believe in what I'm saying. I'm not comfortable. I don't belong here." And the managers respond exactly as their brains have been trained to respond by that body language. They dismiss him. They talk over him. They treat him like his input doesn't matter. The irony is that Peter might have had something valuable to say. The content of his words might have been important. But before anyone's brain even processed the content, it had already received a completely different message from his body. The body language said, "I'm low status, and I'm not confident, and you don't need to listen to this." And once the brain receives that signal, it stops processing the words as information and starts processing them as background noise. This is one of the most underestimated forces in human communication. People spend so much time worrying about what they're going to say, rehearsing their words, trying to get the language exactly right. But research shows that the actual words make up only about 7% of the impact of what someone is communicating. The tone of voice accounts for about 38%. And the body language, the physical presence, accounts for about 55%. Before someone even hears the words, their brain has already made most of its decision about whether to listen based on what they're seeing. When someone's body language is congruent with their words, when the physical message matches the verbal message, people believe them. When the body language contradicts the words, people believe the body language. A person can say, "I'm excited about this project." But if their shoulders are tense, their jaw is clenched, and they're not making eye contact. The listener hears, "I'm anxious about this." A person can say, "I'm fine," but if their whole body is slumped and withdrawn, the listener knows something is wrong. The body always tells the truth, even when the words are trying to tell a different story. For people over 40, there's often a lifetime of accumulated patterns in their body language. Maybe they learned to make themselves small as a child, to take up less space, to not draw attention. Maybe they learned to protect themselves by closing off their chest, by looking down, by speaking quietly. Maybe they learned that confidence was dangerous, that standing out meant being criticized, so they developed a way of moving through the world that said, "I'm not a threat, I'm not trying to take up much space, you don't need to pay attention to me." And now, even when they're trying to communicate something important, their body is still sending those old signals. The signals that communicate high status and confidence are actually quite simple and learnable. Someone with high status typically makes direct eye contact. Not staring, not aggressive, but steady and present. Someone with high status sits with their back against the chair, not perched on the edge. Someone with high status breathes more deeply and speaks at a slower pace. Someone with high status doesn't rush to fill silence. Someone with high status holds their shoulders back and relaxed, not hunched forward protectively. Someone with high status doesn't apologize for taking up space. The opposite signals, the ones that make people tune out before they've even finished their first sentence, are equally clear. Avoiding eye contact signals, "I'm not confident in what I'm saying." Speaking too quickly signals, "I'm anxious and need to get this out before I'm interrupted." Hunched shoulders signal, "I'm protecting myself." Fidgeting signals, "I'm nervous." Looking down signals, "I don't believe I have the right to be here." What's important to understand is that these aren't about being fake or putting on an act. It's not about becoming someone you're not. It's about noticing what signals your body is currently sending and consciously choosing different ones. Because your body and your mind are deeply connected. When someone changes their posture, when they sit up straighter, when they make direct eye contact, when they slow down their breathing, something happens in their nervous system. They actually feel more confident. The body leads the mind. So by changing the physical signals, someone can change not just how others perceive them, but how they perceive themselves. There's a famous study where people were asked to adopt a power pose, standing with their feet apart and their hands on their hips or arms raised. The kind of posture that takes up space and signals confidence. They held that pose for just 2 minutes. And in that 2 minutes, their cortisol levels decreased and their testosterone increased. Their actual neurochemistry shifted, and then when they went into a stressful situation, they performed better and felt more confident. The body had literally changed their brain. So the practice here is surprisingly simple. It's about noticing one moment a day where you're about to communicate something important, and before you do, checking in with your body. Are your shoulders relaxed or tense? Are you making eye contact or looking away? Are you sitting back or perched on the edge of your seat? Are you breathing deeply or shallowly? Then consciously choose one small shift. Maybe it's sitting back instead of forward. Maybe it's making direct eye contact with the person you're talking to. Maybe it's slowing down your speech by just a bit. Maybe it's taking one deep breath before you speak. These small shifts in body language change how the other person receives what you're saying. They change whether the listener's brain decides to tune in or tune out. And over time, as these shifts become more automatic, they start to change how you experience yourself. You start to actually feel more confident. You start to believe more in what you're saying. And that belief, that confidence, communicates itself through your body language in an upward spiral instead of a downward one. Your challenge for this chapter: pick one moment today where you need to communicate something important. Before you do, spend 30 seconds checking your body. Sit up straight. Make direct eye contact. Slow down your breathing. Feel the difference in your body when you're in that posture. Then speak. Notice what happens when your body language says, "I believe in what I'm saying," instead of, "I'm apologizing for existing." Chapter 9. The wrong moment, the wrong place. Why context is everything. There's a historical example that illustrates something crucial about communication that most people completely miss. In the months before the 2008 financial crisis, there were financial experts who understood the danger clearly. They could see the toxic mortgages being packaged into securities, the excessive leverage, and exactly where this system was heading. But when they tried to warn people about it, the warnings fell on deaf ears, not because the information wasn't accurate, and not because the people delivering the warning lacked credibility. The message became unhearable because the warning was coming at a moment when everyone was making money, when the system was apparently working perfectly, when the incentive structure made it far more profitable to ignore the warning than to listen to it. The context made the message impossible to receive. This same dynamic plays out constantly in personal relationships and families. Someone comes home from work and immediately wants to have a serious conversation about money or the relationship, or a hurt that's been building underneath the surface. But their partner is exhausted. Their nervous system is depleted. They've just dealt with stress all day, and they don't have the capacity to process something difficult and vulnerable. The conversation becomes a fight. The message doesn't land, and both people walk away frustrated, thinking the problem is that they can't communicate, when actually the problem was that one person tried to communicate in a context where the other person's nervous system literally couldn't receive the message. This is one of the most underestimated factors in why communication fails. People spend so much time worrying about the right words, the right tone, the right approach, but they spend almost no time thinking about whether the context is actually appropriate for the conversation they want to have. They try to have serious conversations at the dinner table when everyone is tired and hungry. They bring up difficult topics right before bed. They try to discuss hurt feelings in a car on the way somewhere when people are stressed about being late. They try to have vulnerable conversations in public or in front of other people who might hear. They try to communicate when emotions are running high and rational processing is offline. The human nervous system has specific requirements for being able to receive difficult information. When someone's nervous system is in threat mode, when they're tired, stressed, hungry, overstimulated, or already emotionally activated by something else, they literally cannot hear complex or vulnerable information in the way it's meant to be received. The brain is too busy managing the perceived threat to process nuance. It's too busy protecting the system to allow itself to be vulnerable or to genuinely consider another perspective. This isn't a choice. It's neurological. So the question that needs to be asked before having an important conversation is not, how do I say this perfectly? The real question is this the right time, the right place, and the right context for this conversation to actually be heard? Is the other person rested or exhausted? Are they calm or activated? Do they have time and space for this, or are they rushing? Are they alone or feeling exposed in front of others? Is this a moment when they can actually be present? Or are they half distracted and half checked out? For people over 40, there's often a pattern of trying to have important conversations in completely inappropriate contexts. Maybe they grew up in families where conversations happened whenever, wherever, without much thought to whether people were in a state to receive them. Maybe they learned to communicate in reactive moments instead of in intentional ones. Maybe they never saw anyone create a proper container for a difficult conversation. So now they're trying to have serious conversations in cars and at dinner tables and right before bed and in moments of high emotion. And then they're confused about why these conversations go so badly. Creating the right context requires genuine intentionality. It means deciding in advance when you're going to have an important conversation instead of launching into it when something feels urgent in the moment. It means choosing a time when both people are rested and calm, not exhausted or emotionally activated. It means choosing a place where there's privacy and adequate time, not a car or a hallway or a moment squeezed between other activities. It means checking in with the other person. I'd like to talk about something important. Do you have 20 minutes and mental space for this right now? Or would a different time be better? It means being willing to wait for the right moment instead of forcing the conversation when the moment isn't right. This kind of intentionality communicates something important to the other person without being said explicitly. It says, "This conversation matters enough to me that I'm willing to create a proper space for it. I'm not going to ambush you with this when you're vulnerable. I'm not going to force it on you when you're exhausted or overwhelmed. I'm going to give you a chance to show up fully." Which means I'm more likely to actually be heard and understood. It's a paradoxical truth that often surprises people. The people who wait for the right moment to have difficult conversations are often the ones whose difficult conversations actually go well and actually create change. There's also something important to be said about the frequency of important conversations. If someone is constantly bringing up problems, constantly needing to talk about something difficult, constantly trying to process something, the other person's nervous system starts to interpret them as a consistent source of stress. Every time they see that person, they brace for impact. Every conversation feels heavy and draining, and that context makes it harder for anything genuine to be heard, because the listener is already in a protective, defensive posture before the conversation even starts. The practice here is about creating intentionality around communication. Before bringing up something important, pause and ask yourself several questions. Is this the right time? Is the other person in a state where they can actually hear this? Do we have enough time and privacy for this conversation? Am I bringing this up at a moment of high emotion? Or am I calm enough to communicate this clearly? If the answer to any of these questions is no, then wait. Find a better time. Create the container first, and then have the conversation in that created space. Your challenge for this chapter: identify one important conversation you've been trying to have, but that keeps going badly or never seems to land properly. Now create an intentional container for it. Choose a specific time when both people are rested and not rushed. Choose a private place where there won't be interruptions. Ask the other person if they have mental and emotional space for it. Then have the conversation in that created space. Notice what changes when the context actually supports the conversation instead of working directly against it. Chapter 10. How to speak so you're heard without becoming a manipulator. There's a scene in the film Whiplash that captures something crucial about the dark side of influence. The conductor pushes his musicians to reach higher and perform better, but he does it through fear, humiliation, and psychological harm. He gets results. The musicians perform brilliantly, but the cost is devastating. People are traumatized. People lose their confidence. People learn to be driven by fear instead of by genuine passion. He succeeded in getting people to listen and follow, but only by manipulating their psychology and damaging their sense of self. This is the shadow side of communication that most people don't talk about openly. Someone can use psychological leverage, invoke fear, activate shame, or apply relentless social pressure to get compliance. All of these techniques work in the short term and produce immediate results, but they leave psychological damage and resentment in their wake. The person might obey, might comply, might do what's asked, but they do it with bitterness and fear rather than with genuine cooperation. Someone over 40 has usually had enough life experience to recognize manipulation when they see it and to understand what it actually costs. They've been on the receiving end of manipulative communication. They've felt what happens when someone uses their vulnerability against them, when someone activates their shame to get compliance, when someone uses fear as a motivator. They know how that feels in their body and in their relationships. And most of them don't want to be that person. They want to be heard, but they don't want to do it by harming other people. So the question becomes, how can someone actually influence people? Actually get heard? Actually create change without resorting to manipulation and harm? The answer is surprisingly simple, though not always easy to execute. It's about being radically honest about what you want and why, and then genuinely giving the other person real choice. When someone is radically honest about their intentions, when they state clearly what they want without pretense or hidden agenda, the other person's nervous system settles immediately. There's nothing to defend against. There's no manipulation to detect. There's just a person saying clearly, "This is what I want. This is why it matters to me. And I'm giving you the freedom to say yes or no." That clarity and honesty create safety in a way that manipulation never can. This is different from transparency that's still designed to manipulate, or from saying, "I'm just being honest," while strategically framing things in a way that makes people feel obligated to comply. This is actual honesty. where someone is genuinely willing to accept whatever answer comes back. If someone says, "I need your help with this because I can't do it alone," and the other person responds, "No, I'm not able to help right now," that's the end of the conversation. The person doesn't try to persuade them or make them feel guilty for refusing. They simply accept the no. This approach works because it respects the autonomy of the other person in a genuine way. It communicates something unambiguous. Your choice matters. Your freedom matters. I'm not trying to override your judgment or trick you into doing something you don't actually want to do. I'm just telling you what I need and asking if you're willing. You get to decide, and your decision will be respected either way. When people feel that their autonomy is genuinely respected, when they sense they actually have choice and their choice will be honored, they become much more willing to listen and to help. This seems counterintuitive, but it's remarkably consistent across human psychology. People who feel controlled become resistant and resentful. People who feel respected become cooperative. People who feel manipulated become defensive and distant. But people who feel genuinely asked, who feel free to say no without consequences, become willing to say yes. There's another crucial element that determines whether someone can actually influence people with integrity. The person making the request has to mean what they say internally. They can't ask for help while secretly resenting the other person, or ask for change while not actually believing it's possible, or request support while holding on to anger about past failures. The other person's nervous system will detect that incongruence instantly. They'll sense the hidden resentment, the secret doubt, the unspoken anger. And that detection will close down the possibility of genuine listening and real connection before the conversation even deepens. So the work isn't just about what someone says and how they say it. The work is also about making sure internally that they actually believe and want what they're asking for. If someone is asking their partner to listen to them more deeply, they have to actually want that conversation and actually value what their partner will hear. If someone is asking their family to respect a boundary, they have to actually be willing to enforce it consistently. If someone is asking for forgiveness, they have to actually believe that forgiveness is possible and that they deserve it. When all of those pieces are aligned, when what someone says matches what they genuinely feel, when their body language matches their words, when they're truly open to the other person's choice, then their influence becomes honest and powerful. People listen not because they're manipulated, but because they sense integrity. They respond not because they're afraid, but because they feel respected. They cooperate not because they feel obligated, but because they actually want to participate in what's being asked. This kind of influence often takes longer than manipulation. It requires patience and persistence. It requires being willing to accept no as a complete answer. It requires doing the internal work so that the person asking is actually aligned internally. But the results are sustainable and real. The other person doesn't resent the outcome or feel used. The relationship doesn't get damaged by hidden resentment. And the influence that was gained stays stable because it was based on respect and honesty instead of on fear or psychological leverage. The practice here is about noticing when someone feels called to influence another person, and then checking in with themselves honestly about their own motives. What do I actually want in this situation? Am I being honest about what I want? Or am I trying to manipulate this person into feeling obligated? Am I respecting their autonomy? Or am I trying to override it for their own good? Am I willing to accept their no? Or am I trying to persuade them out of it? Is my body language congruent with my words? Do I actually believe what I'm saying? These questions matter because the answers determine whether someone is communicating with integrity or with hidden manipulation. Your challenge for this chapter: identify one situation where you've been trying to influence someone to do something, change something, or understand something. Get brutally honest with yourself. What's your actual intention beneath the surface? Are you being fully honest with them about what you want? Are you actually respecting their right to say no? Is your body language and energy aligned with your words? Have that conversation again, but this time with complete honesty and genuine respect for their autonomy and their freedom to choose. Conclusion: when your words finally become your power. By the time someone reaches this point in the book, they've encountered stories from both films and real life. They've learned about invisible hierarchies and emotional barriers. They've seen why logic so often loses to narrative, how doubt sabotages a message before it's even spoken, and why listening first opens doors that arguing never could. They've explored the impact of congruent body language, the role of context in shaping what gets heard, and the challenge of influencing without manipulating. Taken together, these insights point to something that can feel overwhelming at first. Communication is complex. It isn't just about choosing the right words, sounding confident, or speaking louder. It's about understanding an entire ecosystem of invisible forces that determine whether a voice lands or fades away. It's also about recognizing that you've been operating inside this system all along. And now, for the first time, you can actually see it. What matters most is remembering that understanding the system doesn't require mastering everything at once. No one needs to perfectly regulate their nervous system, tell compelling stories, read context accurately, and maintain full congruence in a single conversation. This work is incremental. The changes are small, and over time, they compound. By the time someone reaches their 40s, they've usually lived long enough to know how powerful small, consistent shifts can be. They've seen it in their bodies after starting to exercise. They've seen it in their finances after developing better habits. They've seen it in their relationships after learning to show up differently. The same principle applies to communication. One conversation where you slow your speech and make direct eye contact is one where you're more likely to be heard. One moment where you pause the urge to argue and genuinely listen is a moment where the dynamic begins to change. One intentional container for a difficult conversation increases the chances that it goes well. Over time, these moments accumulate and form a new pattern. After a few weeks, people begin to notice. They might say things like, "You seem more confident," or "I feel like you're really listening now," or "It feels like my voice matters to you." These comments reflect a deeper truth. Small changes in how someone shows up create real changes in how others respond. Something else shifts as well, often something even more important than external feedback. As a person practices these skills and notices themselves being heard more often, their internal experience changes. They begin to trust their own voice. They start to believe they deserve to be heard. They see themselves differently, as someone whose words carry weight. That internal shift is the most powerful change of all, because it reinforces itself. The more someone believes in their own voice, the more their body language reflects that belief, and the more others respond by actually listening. The stories throughout this book, from financial analysts ignored before a crisis, to a young doctor silenced during a pandemic, to scenes from films filled with miscommunication, all point to the same truth. The world isn't lacking information. It's lacking voices grounded in truth, voices that respect autonomy, that listen as much as they speak. There is no shortage of manipulation or fear-based influence. What's rare are people willing to show up with integrity, clear boundaries, humility, and the courage to say what matters, even when it feels risky. By midlife, many people have spent enough time being unheard that they carry real grief around it. Opportunities were lost because no one listened. Connections were missed because their voice wasn't valued. Over time, they learned to make themselves smaller than they actually are. That grief is real, and it deserves acknowledgement. But it isn't the end of the story. Being over 40 also means carrying wisdom. It means having learned from failure, understanding what truly matters, and developing empathy that only comes from lived experience. These qualities don't weaken a voice. They make it uniquely valuable. The transformation described here isn't about becoming someone new. It's about becoming more fully yourself. It's about claiming the right to your own voice, your boundaries, and your needs. Being heard isn't about perfection, credentials, or saying everything exactly right. It's about showing up as a whole person, body, words, intention, and integrity aligned, and trusting that something real is communicated through that alignment. The practical work is simple. Choose one conversation you need to have. Apply what you've learned. Create an intentional container. Slow your speech. Make eye contact. Listen before you speak. Tell a story instead of building an argument. Check your body language. Make sure your intention is clean and your words are honest. Then speak, not flawlessly, but genuinely. After that, choose another conversation, and then another. Each time, you're rewiring your nervous system. Each time, you're teaching the people around you to listen differently. Each time, you're proving to yourself that your voice deserves space. Over weeks and dozens of conversations, the pattern shifts. Relationships deepen, influence grows, and most importantly, your relationship with yourself changes. You begin to feel like someone whose voice truly matters. The part of your life where you're finally heard, where your words carry weight and the people you love genuinely understand you, doesn't belong to some distant future. It's available right now, in the very next conversation you have. It begins with one small shift, one decision to show up differently, one moment of believing that you deserve to be heard. You've spent enough time being invisible, enough time making yourself small, enough time letting your voice fade into the background. That chapter can end here, if you choose. What matters now is what you do with the voice you already have. Which conversations will you approach differently? What truth will you finally speak? Who do you become when you truly believe your voice matters? The answer doesn't start tomorrow, or after you've reflected more, or once you feel ready. It starts today, in the next conversation. In the moment you sit a little straighter, make eye contact, slow your words, and speak from who you really are. That's where change begins. Your voice is waiting, the world is listening, and you're ready.